Well, good evening to everybody. It's good to see you out tonight on a Tuesday as we go through the week. And there is so much more one can do during the week, and sometimes more that one needs to do during a week. The fact that you're here is encouraging to me, and I hope that you're encouraged by everything we do together tonight. I appreciate Silas and Drew for their part in helping to lead our worship so far. Tonight, talking about the Philistines and an early Messiah. Those words don't usually go together in the same sentence, do they? The Philistines and a Messiah. What are we looking at here? Well, we'll put it together as we go through the lesson. Of course, we think about the Philistines, and who is the most famous Philistine of them all? Goliath, right. That's a story that many of us know. We're going to talk about Goliath with other Philistines tonight. The Philistines in the Bible are typically the bad guys, aren't they? And they're the biggest threat during the time of Saul and David. But they were a threat even before that. Before Saul was king, when Samuel was a little boy, didn't the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant one time? And that went very badly. There were diseases, plagues, everywhere the Philistines took the Ark. They finally decided to send it back. And quite a testimony to the power of God and the honor of God, as in that time associated with that ark. And we talked about arks last night with Egypt. But now we're going to look at the Philistines. Now to get a bigger picture of the Philistines were in Canaan during the time of, Samuel and Saul and David and afterwards. But the Philistines were not originally from Canaan. The Hebrews immigrated into Canaan. They came out of Egypt, didn't they? Wandered for a while, came into Canaan from the east, from across the Jordan River. The Philistines also immigrated into Canaan from a different direction. And we'll see that. The Bible actually remembers them doing this, but so does archaeology. And in the archaeology of the Philistines and where they actually came from originally, and the stories that we have about them with people in the Bible, we can connect it and even connect Jesus to it all. So that's enough. Let's go ahead and get into it. But let's first of all go back in time through the mists of the ages to a time we call the late Bronze Age. And if we're not ancient historians, the late Bronze Age doesn't really sound like anything special. But in the time frame, it's usually linked with about the middle of the 16th century BC, about 1550-ish BC, up till the 1200s, the 13th century before Christ. And we call that the late Bronze Age. Bronze was the big metal of the time. And it replaced by iron eventually. Biblically, we're looking mostly at the time of the Judges. And so we look at the Judges. Okay, so we get past Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and go to the Judges period. And we'll look at that because a lot happens in the world. The Bible doesn't really talk about it openly, but there are hints of bigger events going on in the world at that time. We look through the Bible. And here is a map of the world in the late Bronze Age. And if we get our bearings, we see Egypt down there in the lower left, in yellow, and we go over to the right and we see, Babylon. That's not the same Babylon as Nebuchadnezzar. Same place, but a lot earlier than Nebuchadnezzar, centuries before Nebuchadnezzar was even born. We go up into the green and the purple in those areas, and we start seeing some other names that might not look as familiar to us. And we see like the Hatti and the Mitanni. Well, let's go ahead and start zooming in with some boxes. There's Egypt, and they're in what we call their new kingdom. But there's the Mitanni, and is that name not as familiar as some? The Mitanni, are they even mentioned in the Bible? I'm not sure they are. And the Hatti, it looks kind of like Hittites, and that's correct. That's where the Hittites used to live. But where the change of vowel out, it's not quite as familiar. But we zoom in a little closer, look at some of the other names there. Isua, and the Kizuwatna, and Amuru, and there's Ugarit, it's a city there. And they go up to western Turkey and Arzawa. And in the Roman Empire time, that was Asia. And maybe we can see a little bit of the word Asia in Arzawa. So words kind of, morph over time between languages. But that particular form is not one that we tend to be familiar with. And, there's my favorite, Luca, right down there. Later on, it's called Lycia or Lucia. So that name was kind of preserved into the New Testament period. But a lot of names we're not really familiar with. And there's a question, why there's so many unfamiliar names? We go a lot later, even just a few hundred years later, and the names all change, and they tend to be names that we're more familiar with. But what's with all this? Why aren't these mentioned throughout the Bible? And we're going to talk about that in a second. Something happened. And we can go over into off of Turkey to Greece. And maybe if we've studied history in school and actually paid attention to history class in school, we might find a couple of names there. One is the Minoans. They were on the island that we call Crete. And maybe some of you recall that name, Minoan. They were a Greek people. They didn't actually call themselves Minoans. That's what we call them. We don't know what they called themselves. But one of their kings was named Minos, and so we just call them after the name of their king, the Minoans. But they were some Greek people, very prosperous, and they disappeared. And some have speculated maybe a tidal wave weakened them and some natural disaster, and they were invaded maybe from mainland Greece, and that seems to be the consensus these days. But there's a big civilization, the Minoans, on the island of Crete. And you want to know how advanced they were? We think of those old civilizations as very primitive, and yet the Minoans were quite modern in a lot of ways. And we can tell from the ruins of their society. Here's a painting. Can you tell what these two young men are doing? It's boxing. They had boxing back in the day, and there they are going at it. And look at the quality of this. I guess it's like a griffin or something. It's a mythical creature, but we look closely and we see beautiful lines and the curves and some training in the art. Very sophisticated, very advanced compared to, I could never do this. Admittedly, that's a pretty low bar. I'm not an artist by any means. I could never do that probably, but that's a very beautiful painting, and you have to have some kind of art culture, art schools to have that quality on a consistent level. And they did, even the time of the Judges even. And this is one of my favorites. It's an athletic contest. Can you tell what's going on in that picture? That's a bull. A bull. You had bulls around here. And you see a couple of guys on each end. And in the middle, there's one guy. He is literally flipping over the bull. And that was a popular game back then. Maybe it's not surprising it didn't last very long. We don't do that anymore for obvious reasons. But we have a lot of these pictures, and apparently the idea was a bull runs at you, and can the guy basically do a head flip over the bull without being killed or maimed in some way? And that was a sport, high school bull flipping, perhaps. Anyway, they had that, and that doesn't sound sophisticated, but they had a whole culture around that. Maybe they had, brackets every March or something with it. Who knows? And the archaeology of their main building, we used to call it a palace. And now a lot of people are thinking that may not be the best word for it. If you go there today, it's ruins and you can't really envision it like this. But there's been a lot of excavation. And what does that look like to you? Kind of like a big shopping center, multi-level, something very modern, doesn't it? Yet this is from, 1,400 years before Jesus was ever born, on an island in the Mediterranean. And look how modern and sophisticated that looks. And the belief now is that it's more than just a palace. It was maybe a big cultural center for all kinds of things. Remarkable architecture and skill and beauty. Now, what a society, what a civilization. 3,500 years ago, they were doing this and succeeding at it. But then we have something come along. We call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. And that's exactly what it sounds like. In just a very short time, Virtually every civilization, every kingdom, all those names we saw on the map a minute ago, something happened and they all either disappeared completely or were permanently weakened. Most of them were wiped off the map. Egypt survived, and Egypt lost its power and influence. It was never again a powerful kingdom. It became a second-rate power forever, really. They've, even to this day, never achieved the dominance that they lost during this event more than 3,000 years ago. And what exactly happened? There were invasions, that was the real thing, but what drove the invasions? Peoples came in from all over, and maybe they were driven away. Maybe there was a famine. There might have been a big volcanic eruption that altered the climate for a while, blocked some of the sunlight, and crop failures. But we had this massive migration from all over. And we can't really map all that accurately, but it resulted in a complete collapse of all the civilizations. They're all connected through, like today, where's your phone made? Probably China. Where's your car made? I mean, Toyota, right here. But a lot of cars are made overseas as well, and other electronics. Where do you get your avocados? From Mexico. There's so much international trade today. We're all connected, and that's how they were in that period. Everyone was connected, and when one country went down, they started pulling the others in succession. If they weren't defeated militarily by these invading immigrant forces, they lost their economic power, mass layoffs, mass joblessness, hunger, famine, weakness, governments collapse. Imagine if that happened today. Imagine if the U.S. and China and India and Brazil and the U.K. and the European Union and all these economic powers just sort of all collapsed together. More than the Great Depression, far more than that, where the countries ceased to exist to that level. And that's what happened about 3,200 years ago, the collapse of civilization in the late Bronze Age. Again, every major nation was either destroyed or permanently weakened. And the economics, everything just collapsed. And those that didn't collapse were impoverished and lost their power and influence. And we can put together a lot of pieces. It kind of came from all directions, but mainly it seems from west toward the east. Some of the peoples, we don't even know exactly where they came from. There were no records. They weren't those kinds of societies, but they left for some reason, whether they were seeking new food or they were attacked from someone else and they had to leave because they were forced out. So they came into the eastern Mediterranean looking for new places to live. And they were very violent about it. One of the pharaohs records, a couple of pharaohs record clashes with these invading forces. One of them we talked about Sunday, Merempta. In Cairo, there's a big inscription there with one of my sons a couple of years ago. And he was the son of Ramses, and this is the inscription that has the earliest mention of Israel. We talked about that briefly Sunday. Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. But there's more than just that one line near the bottom, because the rest of the inscription talks about military actions. A lot of them are against these invading forces that came to Egypt trying to find a new place to live. And look at the names. They had names like the Ekwesh and the Teresh, the Luka, that's a little familiar, they're coming from Turkey, Shardana, the Shekelesh. And those are names that most of them are pretty mysterious. And some of them we're not even exactly sure where they came from. But that's what the Egyptians called them. And they were all kind of teaming up, coming in, these different peoples banded together and attacking nations, and often wiping them out in a very short time. And Pharaoh Merempta, he says the Shardin, or Shardana, the Shekelesh, the Ekwesh, he describes them as countries of the sea. They came in from the ocean, from the Mediterranean. So they were by boat, apparently. And he defeated them, as they almost always say they did, whether they did or not. But apparently he did defeat them. And they went away for a while. Then they came back later, a few decades later, in the time of Ramses III. He had the name Ramses, but was from a different family of Ramses II and Merempta. But he was the pharaoh. He was considered maybe the last strong pharaoh of Egypt in history, Ramses III. And another wave of invaders came in during his time, and he had to fight them off. And some of the names are the same, but some of them are different. And he defeated them, but other places, other countries, they were overrun, they were destroyed. And so Egypt sort of stood alone when the war was over. And their former trading partners are gone. People they had alliances with, destroyed. And Egypt is sort of has to deal with the fallout of all of that. It was quite a time. Here is how Ramses describes the attack. Look what he says. It's pretty dramatic. He says, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. Again, they came across from islands, apparently, in the Mediterranean. And look how he says, all at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. And he lists several countries that just were wiped out. The Kate, the Hittites, Kode, Carchemish, Arsawa, Alashia, being cut off at one time. Like all these other countries and Turkey and those areas around there, they all just sort of collapsed and disappeared suddenly. Not some long drawn-out war. It was quite traumatic. And the Bible doesn't talk about this openly, but there are indications that something happened. And maybe one simple way, if we just step back and we look at what conditions are like in Canaan. What was it like in Canaan during the time of Abraham? If we look, he's often just hanging out, walking around, and for the most part, things are pretty peaceful and stable, for the most part. There was one invasion where Lot was captured, but Abraham dealt with that. Other than that, things seem pretty calm and safe as far as those things go. General peace, there's no diplomacy and messaging. The highways are in pretty good shape. People travel around, and there's not really violence on the roads. And violence in the Bible, in the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it's pretty rare. But then go forward a little bit more to the time of the Judges. What's Canaan like in the time of the Judges? And it's a different world. Now the Judges, goodness, there are always invasions or some bandits coming in and they're having their food stolen, they're having their animals taken. People coming from outside or one city just sort of running wild over all the other cities and oppressing people. They're always enemies, and there's this cycle of being beaten up by somebody that a judge comes and saves the day for a while and then starts over again somewhere else. The Judges, it's a very different world than the one of the patriarchs that came before. So what happened between those? And the answer is this collapse of civilization. When you have Egypt strong and stable, and you have the Hittites as a big power, all these other kingdoms, they sort of help police the world and keep things relatively calm. There's a lot of balance of power, and so one side really can't do too much without others responding. Kind of keep each other in check for the most part. But in the time of the Judges, the great powers, they're gone. And so any bully, any bandit, any tyrant, any thug with some armed men can cause a big problem. And there's not really anyone to stop him unless it's like a biblical judge. And so that's what happened to the world. It was the late bronze collapse. And Ramses III gives some more descriptions. Look at this. He's talking about these invaders coming into Syria. He says a camp was set up in one place, in Amurah, and they desolated its people. Its land was like that which has never come into being. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but they wiped out the population. And now you have empty cities and empty towns, abandoned farms. People have been killed or things have just been burned down and depopulated. And it's happened in a lot of places. He describes in detail there. And he says, after that, they were coming forward towards Egypt while the flame was prepared before them. So you can see the buildup. They've destroyed these people up in Syria and Turkey, and now they're working their way down to Egypt. And Egypt is probably anticipating, trying to get their army together to resist. Is it going to happen to us too? And there's a massive battle. And Ramses III gives some scenes from the battle. That's a drawing of the scene he carved in stone in his temple, Medinet Habu. But look at all that mess. I'll give you a slightly better picture in a minute, but he describes some of the peoples. Again, it's a confederation, different groups together. And he calls them the Peliset. Remember that name, by the way. The Cheker, the Shekelesh, we saw them earlier. The Danuna, the Weshesh, lands united, Pharaoh tells us. They laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. So a massive battle. Now Ramses says that he defeated them. And apparently he did, but he also seems to have made a deal with them to work out something because they can't keep doing this. And Egypt probably isn't wanting to have yet another battle come soon because these people keep coming. And so he works some diplomacy out, which has an impact on some things. But where did these people come from? There's been a lot of effort in recent years to figure out these different names. And here's what people have come up with so far. Now, the Peliset, we have reasons to think they came from the island of Crete. And maybe those Minoans that collapsed, and that maybe the Peliset, a couple hundred years after the Minoans were crushed, or maybe they're the survivors of that civilization. There are some reasons to believe that. The Shekelesh, some have suggested maybe they came from the island of Sicily. The boot of Italy, it's kicking the island of Sicily. And why do we say that? Partly because of the name. Look at Sicily, make the C a hard sound. Sicily, Sekelesh, Shekelesh. There's some similarity. So maybe that's where they came from, an island, and they left for some reason. The Danuna, some have wondered, there's some reasons to think maybe they're in some of the islands of the Aegean Sea. Those are the Greek islands between Greece and Turkey. That's the Aegean, that maybe they came from some of those islands. And Shardana, the second from the bottom, some have suggested the island of Sardinia. The names are a little similar again. Sardinia is one of those islands between like Italy and Spain. And so maybe they came from all the way over there. And the Ekwesh, that sounds a little bit like Achaia, which is a name for Greece, like mainland Greece, where Athens and those places are. Some have wondered if they were, the people who had to leave Greece when the civilization there collapsed. The civilization before they left, we call them the Mycenaeans. And maybe, all these different peoples banded up together for some reason. They're all leaving their homelands, and they're attacking these other places like Syria and then Egypt. And so on a map, just to give some scale, we look at these names and where people think they came from at this point, and they're pretty spread out all across the Mediterranean. So why did they leave? Again, we're speculating. Crop failures, invasions, some maybe temporary climate change, which has happened. But they all came into Egypt at this point. And Ramses III describes it. Look closer. Can you see the curves of the ships? They came in by boat. And there's a massive battle up there. And if you can look carefully, their bodies floating in the water from the battle. But the bottom line is after the battle. Look at the bottom line. There are all these people walking. If we look closely, we can make out some Egyptians in there and some other people that are not Egyptian. Here is a picture of a section of that in the original, in relief on stone. Those are some of the invading peoples. They had these sort of feathered hats on, and those are the survivors of these groups that attacked. And that's how Egypt depicts them. And what was the first name that we had in that list from Ramses III? The Peliset. These people, we still know them today, at least their name. Because you take the consonants of the Peliset, P-L-S-T, and it takes very little work to convert that to Philistine. And even today, the Romans took a version of the word Philistine and gave it a new name, which we still use today, Palestina in Latin. And so today, the descendants of the Peliset are still over there, and they're involved in a conflict right now. But are the Philistines the Peliset? And apparently they are, at least in part. Because I told you, Ramses III, he defeated them and then worked out a deal. What was the deal? He resettled the survivors of those invaders into Canaan. He says, you can live up there, have this area, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. They accepted. They came in, conquered out a small area, and they intermixed with the local Canaanites. Those are the biblical Philistines. And the word Peliset was preserved. And we have a version of that in Hebrew. And so the Philistines, The Peliset are believed to have come from Crete, which is one of the Greek islands where the Minoans used to be. And maybe there's some other groups there as well. But the Philistines appear to have had origins in the Greek islands. And the archaeology suggests this. You look at the early pottery of the Philistines shortly after they arrived, and it looks very similar to Greek pottery from that time period. They brought some of their own styles and fashions with them. It changed again over time as they mixed with the Canaanites. They created a new culture that wasn't as Greek, but we can still see the connections there. These groups invaded Egypt, and then Ramses III brought them over into Canaan. And we have the biblical Philistines, immigrants with different groups, but the name Peliset is the one that stuck, and the Philistines. And that name even appears in the Bible. The Peliset, there are a couple versions of that name besides Philistine that appear in the Old Testament. So we do see even a direct connection there. They lived in the area, we call it Philistia. There are 5 principal cities. There Gath and Ekron and Ashdod and Ashkelon and Gaza, which is still in the news today. This is the area of Canaan where they settled and where they lived. The Philistines lived here in the time of Saul, the time of David. And that was the area, some of the area given were granted by Ramses III to these invaders. And the pottery I mentioned is very similar. It has similarities in style and design with the Greeks. And this is from archaeology, but it backs up, it confirms the Bible's description as well. Look what the Bible says about the Philistines in Jeremiah 47. The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh struck down Gaza. This is centuries after the time of the judges and David. Look what he says. The Lord says this, waters are rising out of the north, an overflowing torrent. The Lord is destroying the Philistines, the remnant of the coastland of Caphtor. The Philistines are the remnant of a coastal area called Caphtor. Where's that? The Bible's remembering them being from somewhere else. And the scholars believe that's a name for Crete. And we have indications that they came from the islands in the Greek areas, don't we? The Bible seems to remember the same thing. And we go to the book of Amos, chapter 9, and look what he says in verse 8. Didn't I bring up Israel from Egypt, the Lord says, and the Philistines from Caphtor? The Bible remembers the Philistines coming into Canaan separately from the Hebrews. They were not originally from there. There are also indications in the story of the most famous Philistine of them all, Goliath. 1 Samuel 17 has that famous story, David and Goliath. And this is the only place in the Bible that it gives us a detailed description of someone's weapons and equipment for battle. Look at all the detail of Goliath's armor here. There came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion, Goliath of Gath, one of the Philistine cities, Gath. He had a helmet of bronze, a coat of mail, and it was bronze armor, bronze mail it says. About 125 pounds of armor. That's a lot. Bronze armor on his legs, we call those greaves. And a javelin of bronze between his shoulder, the tip was of bronze. And so you look at those descriptions highlighted there, and if you look at what we know about the Greeks from that period, that's Greek armor. That's the infantry kit of a Greek soldier. In the literature, in the art that we have from the Greeks in the late Bronze Age, that's Greek armor and Greek weaponry. And it even details as well his great spear, his main weapon. Look at the description. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. It's this big, long, thick piece of wood. And the spear's head weighed about 15 pounds. It was iron, not bronze. That's a new technology the Philistines apparently brought in to Canaan. Iron is lighter and stronger than bronze. So technological advantage, which is one reason why they're able to dominate the Israelites so well at first. The Israelites had bronze, heavier or weaker, and the Philistines had this new metal that they could work with, iron. But look at that spear again. There's not actually a name for it in the Hebrew dictionary. It's a new weapon, this long spear. The Hebrew language doesn't have a word, doesn't have a name for that. So it describes it with words that it does have. It's like a weaver's beam. It's a new kind of weapon They haven't had a chance to name it yet. And look at that, a 15-pound point on the spear. What happens if you have this big, long spear with 15 pounds front-loaded on it? If you throw it, how far does it go? It's just going to go right into the ground. 15 pounds on one end, that thing's not, it's not for throwing. A 15-pound spear is one designed to hold and thrust into somebody. Like I could sit here and stab Paul with my great spear like a weaver's beam from this distance. Maybe he has a sword. I can reach out and touch him before he gets close enough to use his sword. That's the main Greek weapon. Greeks had those big spears as their main weapons. Hundreds of years later, they still had them. We call those soldiers hoplites, and they get these big formations of shields and armor, and they'd stab you from, 2 or 3 yards away. And if you get in close enough, then they draw their swords. That's their secondary weapon. Goliath has the same weaponry, a long thrusting spear, and if you get close enough, he has a sword to pull out and deal with you on a close basis. And David used that sword. But that's Greek armor, that's Greek weaponry, that's a Greek spear. The Bible has hints of their origins, not just from Jeremiah and Amos, but from this story. And the style of fighting. Have you ever seen like a one-on-one battle of champions in the Bible before David and Goliath? We have not, because that is Greek-style warfare. If you read the Iliad, that's the famous story about the Battle of Troy. A very popular thing in that story, that was written in the late Bronze Age, right before everything fell apart. And what happens? You have these two armies, and they multiple times bring out a champion from each side to fight each other. And the other armies just watch the two champions go at it. The most famous one is Achilles and Hector, and Achilles won. But there are some other fights like that. But that's the way the Greeks fought. And now they're coming in, and the Hebrews are there, and the Philistines are going full Greek on them. There's Goliath with his Greek armor, his Greek weapons, challenging them to a Greek-style battle, a battle of champions. And the Hebrews are freaked out for various reasons, but everything is so different and new, and it's not the way they're used to fighting. The Bible preserves all that detail, all that Greekness that they still have. Of course, David dealt with that by taking a sniper approach. He can hit me with a spear from 8-10 feet out. I'll just get further out and put a massive caliber round right into where his armor is missing on his forehead. And so David was able to overcome the technological disadvantage and all of that. He was the only one who would take that chance, right? But now that we look at it, we can see it all. And the archaeology is consistent with what the Bible mentions in these unusual details that it gives us about the Philistines, the Pelissetes in particular. But we look at some other names here, other terms. The Philistines weren't just Peliset. Here's a story about David later on, and before he becomes king, he's chasing down some Amalekites and finds a young Egyptian servant. And they're asking, who are you and where'd you come from? And he says, we made a raid against the Negev of the Kerethites, the hard CH. The Kerethites. Who are the Kerethites? Now, I don't recall that name being around, like the Amalekites, the Philistines, the Moabites. Who are the Kerethites? Look at this passage from Ezekiel. You tell me who the Kerethites are associated with. Ezekiel 25. Verse 15, the Lord says, because the Philistines acted revengefully, malice to destroy, with never-ending enmity, thus says the Lord, I'll stretch out my hand against the Philistines. I'll cut off the Kerethites and destroy the rest of the seacoast. Who are the Kerethites associated with? The Philistines. Maybe they're a subgroup. Maybe the Philistines had their own versions of tribes, like the Israelites did. And the Kerethites are one of those groups of the Philistines. And we look at here, we have it again in Zephaniah, chapter 2, verse 5. Woe to you, inhabitants of the seacoast, you nation of the Kerethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. See, they're linked together again. I'll destroy you. And so it seems pretty clear the Kerethites are a type of Philistine. But look at this one from the time of David in 2 Samuel. David's leaving because of Absalom's rebellion. He's evacuating Jerusalem. And look who comes out with David. David's servants all passed by him in the evacuation. All the Kerethites, all the Pelethites. Pelethites? Pelethite, Peleset. There's the word Peleset, the Pelethites. Just make a lisp sound on the S, and they're the Peleset. And 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath, a Philistine city. There are a bunch of Philistines who are now David's servants. When did that happen? Hundreds of them. Hundreds of Philistines, Kerethites, Pelethites, Gittites from Goliath's own town of Gath. And they're all now with David. And so we look carefully at the names and the details in the Bible. The Philistines were not just one solid race. They were a mix, kind of like the Israelites were a mix of tribes. And the Philistines have something like that going on themselves. Canaanites and Peleset and Kerethites and Gittites. And here's another story, 2 Samuel 15, as they're still evacuating the city. Let's keep reading. There's a guy named Ittai the Gittite. And the king says to Ittai, one of his servants, David says, "Why are you also going with us? Go back and stay with the king. You're a foreigner. You're an exile from your home." See, Ittai, he's not an Israelite. He's from Gath. He's a Gittite. And David's saying, go back to your homeland. You're not a part of this issue with this civil war we're fighting with Absalom. But look at Ittai's response. As Yahweh lives, Yahweh is the God of Israel, and as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king will be, death or life, I'll be there too. He is loyal to David, and he's loyal to the God of David. This Philistine from Gath worships and serves the God of Israel and is loyal to the king of Israel. Again, when did that happen? At some point. And later on, when they fought the battle against Absalom, David divides his forces, 1/3 under Joab, who was his nephew, by the way, the commander of the army, and 1/3 under Joab's brother Abishai, another nephew of David. And who gets the last third? Not a relative of David. Ittai the Gittite, the Philistine, gets to command 1/3 of David's army against Absalom. So this guy had unusual access to David and great trust from David in this Philistine. Here's another story from David's time, which I find intriguing. And there's a point from it as well. When David was moving the ark to Jerusalem, what did he do? He put it on a cart, and then it stumbled, and the oxen stumbled, and a guy named Uzzah touched the ark, and he died because he touched the ark. Look what happened to the ark. I mentioned this verse on Sunday, but I didn't focus on this detail. While they're sorting things out and trying to figure out what to do, David took the ark into the house of a guy named Obed-Edom the Gittite. And it stayed there for a while. Now again, what's a Gittite? We just saw that, didn't we? A Gittite is, Goliath was a Gittite. It's someone from Gath, a Philistine. So what just happened here? There's Gittites who followed David from Gath. Gittites are people from the Philistine city of Gath. Obed-Edom, who has the ark in his house, he's a Philistine who apparently lives over on the way to Jerusalem. And David took the Ark of the Covenant into the house of a Philistine for 3 months. And the text just happens to mention here, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his household for that 3 months. What happened the last time Philistines took the ark in possession? Didn't go very well, did it? That's when they captured it in the time of Samuel, and wherever the Philistines took the ark, there were plagues and diseases and tumors and things like that, very badly for them. And they sent it back to Israel. The text seems to wants to realize something here. It points out it went into the house of a Philistine again, this time in different circumstances. But the Lord didn't treat the house with diseases this time. What did the Lord do to the Philistine? He blessed him. For the 3 months the ark was there. The Spirit of God that inspired this apparently wants us to catch that detail. It wants someone to catch it. It makes the Spirit, he makes a choice to mention that detail. Can we get a lesson from this? See, even in the Old Testament, it wasn't really about what people you were born into. What matters is, do you serve the Lord? Here's a Philistine from Gath, but he serves the Lord. And of all the people in Israel, it doesn't go to any of them. It goes to the Philistine, and the Lord blesses that Philistine, even in the time of the Old Testament, because he's a servant of God and a servant of the Lord's anointed, David. And what's the word for anointed? The Messiah. Messiah means the one who's anointed. David was a Messiah because the Lord had him anointed. And Obed-Edom served David and served the God of David. And the most holy object to the Israelites could be in his house, and blessings came forth. So let's wrap this up. Why talk about all these things? And we're getting some texture on the Philistines now, where they're from, and they're not just universally bad either. A bunch of them defected or changed loyalty and came to serve David. And when he's in Jerusalem, they're also around Jerusalem. And in the darkest moment, when Absalom seems to have all of Israel with him, the Philistines are still loyal to David, and they help him defeat Absalom. Philistines. There's a prophecy in Micah that I think it's a prophecy about Jesus. But look at this, in Micah chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. It shall come to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It shall be lifted above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it. Notice it doesn't just say the people. Different peoples, different kinds of peoples will flow into the house of the Lord. Do we recognize what this prophecy is talking about in the latter days? That seems to be connected very much with Jesus, the Messiah. And it keeps going. Many nations shall come and say, let's go to the house, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he can teach us his ways, we can walk in his paths. Who's saying that? Other nations, not just the Israelites. Many nations had the same goal, the same focus. This is a prophecy about the new covenant, clearly. The gospel, which brought nations together. Look at this passage in Isaiah 11, also talking about sometime in the future. In that day, the root of Jesse, David's father, who shall stand as a signal for whom? The peoples, other nations, not just Israel. Of him shall the nations inquire. His resting place shall be glorious. In that day the Lord will extend his hand a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people. From Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. Philistine areas, islands. He'll raise a signal for the nations. Will assemble the banished of Israel. He's not just talking about the people of Israel. He's talking about his people in all nations. Peoples, nations coming together. The root of Jesse. David's an ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. But David really, he's a living foreshadowing of Jesus, the Messiah. Look at the similarities between David and Jesus. Both of them are born in Bethlehem. That's an easy one. Both of them are from Jesse's line, and Isaiah focuses on that. Both of them were kings that people did not expect initially. Jesus, they didn't expect the kind of king he came out to be. And David, he was not born into a kingly family. There was already another king when David was younger. And a lot of people opposed him at first. He ended up being king over everybody, but that's not the way his life initially seemed to be going. Both of them were persecuted and rejected by their own people before they became kings. And both of them brought the other nations to the God, the one true God. Jesus does through the gospel, of course. And are any of us Jewish tonight? I think we're mostly, if not entirely, Gentile in this room. So we're clearly living examples of how the Messiah brought the nations to the God of Jacob. But what did David do? How many Philistines were with David? And different types of Philistines. And the Philistines came from all over the Mediterranean. One could say the Philistines represented the entire Mediterranean world. these different subgroups that made up the Philistine peoples from different islands, different locations. And what did so many of them come to do? They joined the Lord's anointed and came to serve the God of Jacob in the time of David. So we see that the Philistines, and also in Jerusalem, Jesus in Jerusalem, the temple was, and David. We have the Gittites and the Kerethites in Jerusalem with David as well. The archaeology helps us understand what people understood 3,000 years ago. The Israelites of David's time, and even afterward, of Jeremiah's time, of Amos's time, they knew where the Philistines had come from. They knew better than we do. They were closer to events. They still had that history circulating. They knew exactly where the Philistines had come from, at least a lot of it, and they were witnesses to some of the Philistines in David's time joining the Messiah, joining the anointed David and worshiping the God of Israel. And those details are preserved for you and me in the Bible to read and understand. And that's exactly what Jesus did. So this is one of the benefits of archaeology. It's not just a hit list of, see, this is true and that was true and this person existed. It helps us see the Bible and see people and events more closely as the original people did. These understandings, these common cultural knowledge and understandings, that some of that's been lost, we can recapture, regain some of that. Aren't we originalists with the Bible? Aren't we trying to restore original biblical Christianity? We're trying to be originalists and restorationists. Archaeology is an excellent tool because it gives us more of an original understanding. It gets us closer to the perspective and the eyes and the mind of people from Bible times. It covers that gap of time and space that we have to deal with today. We're thousands of years later on the other side of the world. Archaeology can help bring us back and connect us to see the Bible through more original eyes. I hope that's a benefit for anyone who's a serious Bible student. And I hope it encourages you, and as it has me, can train you as well to read the Bible more carefully. I've learned to read the Bible much more carefully as I've gotten to study the archaeology. How many details are just woven in there that I used to just skip over? Doesn't mean anything to me. And now I see the word Pelephite or Kerethite or Philistine and it pops. And I pay more attention. And when we pay more attention, we learn more of what the Lord put in His Word. And that's always a good thing. We're going to sing a song in just a moment. I will call upon the Lord. The Philistines came to call upon the Lord, but He still has the same message today. The nations coming in to the house He built, the temple, the living stones of the church where God dwells today. He calls you. Take a lesson from some of those Philistines. Come to the Lord. Show yourself to be a fulfillment of these prophecies from so long ago. They were talking about you. Live for the purpose God put you here for. Obey the gospel if you need to while we stand and sing.